pleased to have with me this morning a good friend of mine, actually, Mark Hanley from IT Strategies. Mark, good morning to you.
Good morning, Fraser. Thank you for asking me. It's a pleasure to talk. We need all to communicate as much as we can since we can't go and visit each other, so good.
Yes, very true, very true. And you're in Texas at the moment, I hear, rather than in Boston? Or in...
Yes, I have, my son lives down here and he's running a business which fortunately is doing well. And so we came down here to support him. So back home tomorrow to quarantine.
Yes. Anyway, on that note, the session is called COVID and the Silver Lining for Production Print. So your sessions are always very popular when we do these, and that's because you obviously know your stuff, which is great. And I think that sense that silver lining may be there somewhere in the future is good for us to know. As for anyone who doesn't know, Mark, you've been in the industry since, well, IT Strategies you started in 1992, is that right?
92 IT Strategies. I've been a consultant to the business since 85, and before that I came out of the paper industry.
Yeah, right. So your area, your kind of sense, what you really like, what's the stuff that you really like getting sort of nitty gritty with? What's the what particular segments do you find particularly interesting?
Well, you know, commercial print and packaging, if I can make it that simple, both have a great production digital future. And I guess what makes it all still interesting, though sometimes frustrating, is the fact that the opportunity is still very much ahead of us. So that gives you kind of a background optimism. But the fact that we say now, after, you know, quite a few years of having production digital technology with us, the fact that we still say it's really a big future opportunity indicates how hard it is. But oddly enough, although COVID is a terrible situation commercially for all of us, I do actually think it's going to break the logjam. So that's basically why I call this a silver lining. If you like, Fraser, there's a small silver lining and a big silver lining. The small silver lining is if you happen to be in a business where you can leverage needs that have come up as a direct result of COVID. So for example, digital label printers are doing great. And that's because the demand patterns have been so fundamentally altered for everyday demand necessities like food and drink, and even pharmaceuticals, of course, and such consumer products. That's created a complete shift in the pattern of demand, meaning different products are wanted in smaller quantities in different places at different times. And of course, digital's great at responding to that. And that doesn't just apply to labels, it applies to packaging, although in labels for digital, it's more important because labels is a much more established digital production market there. But even in the very early markets like corrugated, we've seen a positive demand trend. Now, demand trend isn't quite the same thing as people are still buying lots of equipment. They are in these areas buying equipment, but people are also, obviously everybody, no matter who you are, is more conservative now, let's say, about CapEx, actually spending capital on things. But in some of these sectors, they are still buying, and it has been a benefit. So that's the kind of, and even in wide format, people who have got into the signage business related to the way people have to respond to a retail environment, say signage showing you where to go, where to stand, what products are where, and a directional signage, simple stuff. That's also been a bit of a silver lining. And I've just heard from wide format printers here yesterday that they wouldn't have survived but for that. But the big silver lining is a different thing, just to set the tone for what I really want to talk about today. Big silver lining is about, we believe that when this situation stabilizes, and we'll talk about when it might, but when it stabilizes in the midterm, 1, 2, 3 years, don't know which, at that point, we think that print providers and brand owners are going to be very, very selective about where they spend capital. And I think that's going to hugely go to the benefit of digital. I think in some areas like commercial printing, sheet offset vendors are going to have a really tough time, and it's going to go to the benefit of digital. Then the question is digital ready?
Sure. So you're going to share with us a couple of slides just to give some context to your analysis of the market. So just going over to you to share the slide.
Yeah. Let me just put this slide up.
Yep,
so let's talk about a little more detail, some of the themes I raised around COVID. And I'm focusing
can you just put that into...
Yes, sorry, of course. So COVID and production digital print is my theme, and I've got 4 points I want to make. The first is, I suppose it's obvious, but we've stayed close to the vendors and have seen evidence for this, that since March, April, CapEx spending, that is spending large amounts of capital for large digital systems, has just been destabilized since March, April, everywhere. And this is because of uncertainty, which always makes people reluctant to give up their dollars. But it's also because, quite concretely, a lot of consumer demand, which drives digital print and production digital print, especially in advanced consumer economies like US and Europe, a lot of consumer demand has really been permanently damaged. And I do say permanently, because when I look at things like events, I look at travel, I look at trade shows, I even look at consumer retail, which God knows in our country, in the US, was in a terrible state before COVID. When I look at these things and then I look at what happened as a result of COVID, I mean, there's no way this is just a temporary event which people bounce back from. This is permanent damage to demand and change in demand patterns. It doesn't mean demand won't come back, but it's going to come back in a different way, and it's going to take its good time to do so for these changes to work through the market, 2 or 3 years maybe. So just think about air travel. I mean, we all pretty much acknowledge, yeah, we're not traveling right now, but when we can again, it's probably going to be very different. Maybe fewer people will travel. So these things are making people, from a capital expenditure point of view, wonder what they should be buying, and they're kind of waiting to see. So that's the effect on capital expenditure. And if you are today a vendor of equipment that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, this has hit you badly, no question. We do think things will bounce back, but they'll bounce up and down, is our view. For the next couple of years, you're going to see upticks and you're going to see downturns, and it's going to be unstable because all of this restructuring in demand is going to just take time, even in the best possible world. And we're hardly in the best possible world yet, since we don't even know what this virus is going to do for the rest of this year in the major economies. My second point is there have, of course, as I mentioned before, been some advantages. So I was actually surprised that when I look at some of the label vendors in the digital production area, their sales have been holding up. And we're talking here high capital expenditure, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it goes a little bit against my first point, but it's a very specific sector. You kind of might expect that, of course, with people staying at home, the demand for food, drink, and consumer products in many, many cases doesn't diminish. It simply changes where it comes from and exactly what it is. And of course, those changes have been to the benefit of the kind of digital technologies which, at the press of a button, can produce a different label with a different content. It's actually quite hard to do. In fact, in packaging, in analog print, because in packaging in general, the trend, of course, has been for the last 30 years to raise the volumes and lower the costs. It was all about cost. And so the analog package printing business is very much tied to large quantities, very much out of tune with the needs of the market as a result of COVID. So digital's benefiting in labels, it's benefiting a little in packaging because it's only got a very small footprint in packaging in things like corrugated and a tiny bit in flexible packaging. We've seen some effects, as we said before, on signage and wide format. But if we look at a market, on the other hand, like commercial print, that's a much worse picture. There's much less immediate need to adapt communications print in support of the overall commercial economy. as a result of COVID than there might be in these packaging related areas. My third point here is that, and this is the real silver lining, and I really do want to focus on this, we think this is such a huge change in the patterns of demand. One of the things that's going to happen over the next 1 to 3 years is we're going to see a lot of print providers go out of the picture. So consolidation, we always talk about it, but this is real consolidation. So we could imagine that in commercial print alone, maybe up to 30% of print providers in US and Europe could actually disappear or cease to be independent. So this is going to further concentrate the industry. And when I talk about concentration, if I look, for example, at commercial print, or I look at folding carton, or I look at flexible packaging, it's always shocking to people to realize that half of the revenues in each of those markets are under the control of less than 50 companies. And I'm talking worldwide when I say that. So it's already a concentrated industry, and it will become more so. And our opinion is that by the time these demand patterns have sorted out, we're going to have a more complex world. We're going to have a world which is understanding the need to be much more flexible, all of which favors digital as against analog. And in fact, the arguments for analog, if I look, for example, at the commercial print world, analog has survived incredibly well against digital and still has a huge dominance over digital up to the point of COVID in US and Europe. And one of the reasons for that is because analog has been able to increase its productivity by an average of close to 10% every year. And this went to the benefit of print providers who were willing to put their capital expenditures much more in that direction than digital. However, that productivity advantage every year improving from analog, we think, is beginning to go away because anybody in the commercial print world will tell you about the increased dominance of short runs. Short runs mean in the analog world, you have to stop a print machine. You have to stop it to change the plates. You have to stop it to make the plates. You have to stop it sometimes to change the colors if it's a special color. And you have to wash up, and you have to stop it to change the media. The more short runs they are, no matter how efficient the analog manufacturers make their presses, if you have to stop the press more and more every year, that's kind of taking away from the productivity advantages you're getting from the analog press manufacturer. So we think the interest over the next 4 to 5 years in spending most of your capital, which is the historic pattern in analog technology, is going to greatly diminish. And that opens up the gates for production digital technology if it's ready. The question of if it's ready is relevant because we're talking about real reliability on an analog kind of a specification. We're talking about parity of performance in every other way, at least up to certain economic run length levels, say mid-run lengths, which would be about 30 to 40% of markets. But we're beginning to see that digital technology with inkjet, with maybe Lander, products like that, now with single pass electrophotographic technology, maybe from Indigo, that was announced at the beginning of the year. We could imagine that in 2 or 3 years, one or more than one of these production digital technologies will be ready to take advantage of this weakness on the capital expenditure side, where people don't want to spend money on technologies where they're in a market where they can't control the price. It's not finally digital. It's not producing the productivity gains it used to. This is the opportunity for digital. Yeah. And a real step change.
Can I just ask a couple of questions? I know that you asked me at the beginning just to sort of stop and kind of explore some of these areas. I just want to kind of get my head around, for the last maybe 10 years, the digital print world has actually been, in a way, the evolution of technology was driven by what the printer wanted, but by what the manufacturers wanted to invent. I know that sounds a bit odd, but that sort of, desire to invent quickly.
Supplier-driven, yes.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes.
And that's been happening for years. You go from sort of 2002, 3, 4, 5, and onwards. Now, we're at the point now where I'm just wondering whether those major manufacturers are also going to survive, and there were a number of major manufacturers. Will there be also some fallout in that? Because particularly in things like the wide format segment, as you've just said, that segment's lost quite a lot of business through COVID, and that changes the dynamic. You also have just said 30 to 40% of commercial print production will disappear in the next 2 years. That's dramatic. Does that mean we're going to have a completely different landscape in the technology available for people? And that might shift the way businesses operate, because there'll only be certain amounts of bigger businesses that can afford to buy into Lander technology. And then the sort of mum and pop smaller side, they're going to just be doing something different. Does that make sense, Mark? There's a lot in there.
It does make sense. It's a very good point. Will the vendors be ready with the right product? So, for example, good example of that is you look at inkjet today, and inkjet, on paper is a very fast, efficient technology. It's not so great printing on every coated paper you want to print on, but most of it is in continuous web format, okay? And their appeal, where they want to go, where they say they want to go, is the commercial print market. That's a market which is entirely sheet-fed dominated. So that's a good question right there. If you want to take inkjet into commercial print, shouldn't you follow the format that they want? And there's good reasons why they have it. So if you don't, will you survive? It's a really, really good question. I personally think that, and to your other question, which I think is also an excellent point, how many places can you actually sell? If you look at the commercial print market, okay, over 50% of the revenues in the commercial print market are controlled by about 40 companies, all right? And they have many sites, but the place where you actually sell, it's a company, generally not a site, or that's the smart place to sell. And not all of them are going to be immediately interested in digital. So that's a small number right there for half the revenue. Now, after that, if you look at all the companies that are, let's say, in the mid-run lengths in commercial print, because we recently did this calculation, worldwide, that's less than 8,000 companies, 8,000 companies. So indeed, for the digital print world to be prepared to sell, frankly, small numbers of equipment at high prices, and then be able to earn off the consumables, that's a new model for them, which they've done in the office on a totally different scale. And whether they can adapt fast enough is a very good question. But the simple answer is, Fraser, that the field of digital print vendors and production digital print in 5 years probably will look very different, yes.
Yeah. Can I just ask a slight aside question? And it's more because I've heard it mentioned a couple of times. You were identifying that the COVID crisis, certain segments have really suffered. And as you said, and you're dead right, certain bits of the print market, depending on what markets you aim at. I'd heard mentioned a couple of times that direct mail had seemed to be okay because actually we're at home. There's a sense that actually paper-based product is okay again. Have you noticed that at all? Or is that
yes, direct mail among all the other sectors is certainly not the worst hit, and direct mail is now very efficient, and it's very efficient as a result of digital print. A ever increasing share of the direct mail market is now inkjet printed, so it's very efficient and able to adapt quickly. And yes, you're quite right that it's a home market, and it offers not only the opportunity to maybe get more people's attention because they're more at home, but it offers also the opportunity to leverage their changing demand patterns now that they want to buy different things at home. So you're right, but the thing is that you've got to remember direct mail. I think close to half of direct mail is in the US worldwide, okay? It's more difficult in Europe because of post office issues and because of legal issues wherein you can say, don't put that in my letterbox, that kind of thing. And in Asia, it's sort of smaller consumer economies, not so well developed. So you're right, but when I look at it in the big picture, it doesn't greatly alter the big picture.
Mark, it was only that, as you said at the beginning, this was about silver linings, and you mentioned that commercial print was suffering considerably. and I was just looking for a bit of a silver lining in some of the segments that are related to commercial. But
Yeah, you're right.
let's go to your, I know you've got another slide you want to share, which really looks a bit more at the technologies and where you see those silver linings in terms of the technological developments that might
Yes.
occur in the...
So I started mentioning this a bit. I think it's worth saying where the technologies are, because if I'm right that a big opportunity is opening up within less than 5 years, who's going to take it? First of all, just to re-emphasize what I said before very quickly, offset commercial print and folding carton, which is the same basic print technology used there, are suffering from diminishing productivity gains from the analog technology. And that's making most print providers in already a very dire economic situation question, in our view, whether long term they want to spend many more millions of dollars on sheet offset analog technology. And there's an awful lot of very new presses going to come onto the market as lots of print providers go out of business, I might add. Turning quickly to packaging, where flexo is much more dominant, also some gravure. This is, as I said before, very much driven by high volumes, and as the demand patterns for consumer goods, which are what packaging is made for, radically fragment, as they've been doing, by the way, for 25 years, and as they do so more as a result of this crisis, the inefficiency of current high volume dominant analog technology is going to become more and more evident. These are the two reasons why we see a doorway opening up, both in commercial print and packaging. Now, so what does digital do about that? We've got three real technologies here. We've got electrophotography. Up to now, I have to say, electrophotography has done a great job on quality, but it's basically been relatively slow and not all that reliable. Despite that, it's been successful because it's gone for low volume markets at high values, and that's been a great model. But can it grow up and go for mid-run lengths and take 30% of existing analog markets? Maybe. The sign of hope I've seen is Indigo's new LEPX technology, which is a single pass technology, where they've quadrupled the speed, and I think that will have a role to play. And Indigo always pulls a rabbit out of the hat. But there's not too much else in electrophotography which makes you say, wow, that's going to be much better in 3 years. If we look at aqueous inkjet, I'd say obviously that's today's fastest digital production technology. Look, let's not kid ourselves, in both format and its performance on coated papers and films, it still has significant strides to make. It's difficult to say will it and by when, but it needs to, and it has the opportunity in front of it. Let me leave it that way. There's a huge amount of investment in it, and there's some very good technology there. So aqueous direct inkjet is in the game, all right? And finally, we must mention Landa. Landa have kept their powder dry and haven't talked too much about their technology. It's taken them 15 years to get where they are. They held a public press conference or presentation last week where they said they had about 10 customers, and they're real customers who've really done the hard beta work necessary. So Landa is interesting because it really is very fast. At 6,500 B1 sheets an hour, you're talking analog speeds there that you get up to these mid-run lengths. And in addition, it is B1. It's a sheet format, which is what I believe the folding carton and the commercial print market won, and later on they've got a continuous feed product for flexible packaging, which I think is probably the biggest opportunity of all. So Landa either works or it doesn't, and I think we're going to know pretty soon now, next couple of years. And if it does work, it's also looking at this opportunity. So between all these different trends that I'm describing here, something really good and big is going to emerge. That's basically what I wanted to say today.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just wonder, as we wrap up, do you sense that aqueous direct inkjet in projects that were sort of more industrial projects, and industrial I mean manufacturing rather than large scale, do you sense that COVID's been there, but those kind of ongoing big projects to change the way you produce product, they haven't changed. They're not going to change. Those kind of underlying issues.
They're not so affected, Fraser, because when you look at those more industrial markets, they're much smaller and at a much earlier stage of development, and so they're much less, if you like, deeply involved in the ups and downs of the consumer economy. And people have budgets for these things which are already in place. I think there's probably some slowdown. I mean, there must be some people saying, let's just not spend anything right now. But in general, when we also track the sales of printheads, for example, into these markets. And in general, we haven't seen dramatic drops there. We've seen some. But I would say that's been more stable. But you know, be careful. It's stable because people haven't got so much skin in it. It's a smaller market. But nevertheless, it is in the end a positive benefit. It does mean that there's continuity in that, and that we should all be glad of. So I think that is also, on its scale, it's also a silver lining, yes.
And I, you know, obviously we've got a couple of, well, more than a couple. I think we've got 3 or 4 contributions throughout the week, this week, from Lander, who've been a big supporter of our virtual summit. So they're obviously, you know, using this period of time to really start the ball rolling. As you said, they were very active in the last couple of weeks, and we'll see where they get to. I mean, it's obviously they're upping their game in terms of, you know, going to market, aren't they? Truly going to market. So
yes, you're right. It's a very, very interesting enterprise, and you know, without getting into it all now, if you look at why it came into being, what it's trying to do, it's really, really interesting. The question really is simply, does it work? And you know, if it does, and I mean at parity with analog in terms of reliability, that's a big, big barrier to cross. If it does, however, and we should definitely not exclude that possibility. If it does, then it does change the rules of the game. It's going to be simply massive pressure on direct aqueous inkjet for the volume markets like packaging, commercial print. At that point, the rules really would change. So I'm as fascinated as you to watch that, and it's very important to keep an open mind.
Yeah, and on that note of kind of real innovation, is there anything else as we just kind of wrap up today that you've spotted or that you've seen in this kind of climate that you'd say, watch this space, this might be interesting?
Well, I'll give you an example, which I think you're going to find across all markets. I think smart vendors are getting much more specialized or getting much more focused on their particular strengths. Let me give you an example. We saw a launch for the first time from Epson of a flatbed UV printer this last week. This thing has 10 color capability. And it's about, you know, it's under 100,000, put it that way. I suspect, this is my opinion, it will end up significantly under 100,000. If you know that market, that is a step towards a very specialized, high quality self-identification there. I think that's an example of the way that you see innovation coming in now. If somebody was specifically focused, say, more on the textile apparel market, you'll probably see a more integrated offering of conversion and print coming out at the same time. You'll probably see much more push on the lower cost, environmentally friendly things in that area, like dye sublimation. You're going to see that specialization, and you're going to see people move up in specification, going to higher quality, high-end flatbeds, in my opinion. I think you'll see that, and they will anchor themselves in high-value sales rather than high volume of printers sales. So I think that's the kind of thing you're going to see in the next year or two.
That's interesting. Well, I'm very pleased that we've got something, you know, that's a little bit of insight into where you think the future will be. Mark, thank you for your time. I appreciate that. As I said, you're always very popular with our audience, and again, I think you've really given us some interesting things to think about. So thank you very much, Mark. Hope to see you soon.